What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, before I get going here, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out on YouTube every single week. So much news has broken today. There is plenty to get to on the transfer front, coaches coming in and out of Major League Soccer, all kinds of good stuff to discuss today, starting with the biggest transfer, I would argue, of the last 72 or so hours. It is not official yet. It appears that Declan Rice is headed to Arsenal, though. Everybody is in agreement, so I feel comfortable going with it. It's just a matter of kind of finalizing the details, but the actual fee appears to have been agreed according to everybody's reporting, and Manchester City don't seem to be a factor at this point. West Ham have a deal with Arsenal. It's just a matter of when all of this officially gets finalized. You're also seeing reports that he's got the go-ahead to do his medical and all of that stuff. So, barring some kind of very bizarre turn of events, Declan Rice will be a Gunner next season. And so a lot of the conversation as this transfer has been talked about and the speculation has started to ramp up and the price tag has been laid out there, some of the bids that Arsenal have made have gotten laid out there, is this idea of can Declan Rice actually be worth the money Arsenal are paying for him? The answer is absolutely yes. Reason number one is that, and I kind of mentioned this before, but I didn't go 100% in on it, which is what I'm going to do now. Arsenal's title hopes next season hinge on getting this deal done. They are not winning the Premier League next season if this deal does not happen. Now, they won't necessarily win the Premier League because Declan Rice is there. Certainly Manchester City are still the favorites. But if you want to build off of what you did last season, to sustain it, to improve it, and give yourself a real shot at winning the title, to not just be one of the hopefuls chasing Manchester City, but to actually be a team that might be on their level, they had to fix this spot. And it appears Thomas Partey might be on the way out anyway, but that midfield needed revamping. And I said after that Manchester City game, when Partey in particular did not perform well, and you saw kind of a dip in the performance of those holding midfielders at the end of the season, that game was screaming for Declan Rice. That was the missing piece. And Arsenal appear to have gone and got him. Yeah, it's expensive. I don't care. This isn't just about Declan Rice. This is about what it does for your entire team. The second point, if that's not enough to convince you. If Enzo Fernandez is worth breaking the transfer record for, after he had played all of, I believe it was, 6 months or something in Europe, then surely Declan Rice is worth that kind of money too. Now, I understand, and I am not necessarily of the belief that Enzo Fernandez was worth the money Chelsea paid for him. And certainly his value skyrocketed after what he did at the World Cup. But that's just the world we're living in now. Declan Rice is not an anomaly. And he is a much more proven commodity than Enzo Fernandez. He's an England international. That also makes him expensive. But he is a proven high-level Premier League player, one of the best in the league at his position. It's a position Arsenal needed. And especially now that you're retooling that midfield, you needed an elite player in that number 6 spot. And not only did you need that, you need it even more now with this addition of the team, because the Kai Havertz deal is now official. And I talked last week about how I just didn't really get it, and it didn't make sense to me from an attacking standpoint. And that I had to believe Mikel Arteta had some kind of plan that would at least make it make a little bit more sense. And it seems like he does, and that is he's going to play Kai Havertz next to Martin Odegaard as the 2 number 8s, which I like a lot better. I'm still not in love with it, but that's the only way you're going to get the kind of return on the investment that Arsenal are hoping to get on this Kai Havertz deal. Which makes it even more important that you have somebody who is capable of doing the defensive work, of facilitating the attack, when you have two attack-minded, not really box-to-box guys. They'll do the defensive work, they'll do the pressing, but are they doing the tracking? And what happens when you lose the ball? You've got to maintain possession if you're going to kind of go all in on this City model, even more than Arsenal already had. Because that's really the story of this offseason to me for Arsenal. Is that Arteta is doubling down on this. You saw the inverted fullbacks, he already got that going. Now he's saying, I'm going to flip the midfield. And we're going to do what Manchester City do, where you have an Ilkay Gundogan and a Bernardo Silva, or a Kevin De Bruyne, usually Gundogan and De Bruyne, as those two kind of roaming number 8s that are really just attacking midfielders. But they dominate the ball so well, and Rodri does all of the defensive positioning and the defensive work to help they maintain possession, that you don't need somebody else in the midfield, and when you do, you move up John Stones. If this is going to work, that Rodri position is crucial. And Arsenal didn't have anybody to play it. Now it seems they got Declan Rice. It's one of those where it may not ultimately be worth it in the end when you look back on what Declan Rice gives Arsenal. But it is absolutely worth the price for the opportunity it gives you. It is worth the risk, 100%. And to me, it's not a massive overpay. It's a little bit of one. But like I said, if Enzo Fernandez is worth that kind of money, considering his career trajectory, Declan Rice is too. The other big midfield signing in the Premier League that became official is James Madison going to Spurs. Like I said, Declan Rice, not official yet. Spurs have announced James Madison. To me, this move makes more sense than him going to Newcastle. He could have worked at Newcastle too. I just don't want James Madison on the wing. And I worry that if you put him and Bruno Guimaraes in the same midfield, they're just kind of taking up each other's space a little bit, and they don't necessarily complement each other all that well. Because they're both creative. They're both kind of guys who facilitate and attack and set up other players. Right. Guimaraes is not Kai Havertz, where he's a finisher coming from the midfield. So it could have worked. I wouldn't have been opposed, because you're getting a good deal on Madison because his team got relegated and he was going to leave this summer. But for Spurs, they haven't had a player like this since Christian Eriksen. This gives you a completely different dimension to your midfield and to your attack in general that was so based off of counters, that didn't really have a lot of creativity, that was so reliant on Harry Kane's individual brilliance. This gives you something different. It allows you to be more multidimensional in attack. So I really like this signing. It makes a lot of sense. This is the kind of player Spurs need to help maximize those three attackers ahead of him. And at the same time, this is a player who just had a team who couldn't save his team from relegation, who is up and down at times. I mean, when he's in form, he's brilliant, and there are stretches where it's not so great. But he's absolutely should be playing at a club like Spurs. This just doesn't change the bottom line for me. And it was never supposed to. But I've gotten fooled by the Spurs team too many times before, where you look at the names and you talk yourself into they're a top 4 easy, maybe they can mount a title challenge. Look at all the names. And so I already see this happening with that midfield. Madison, Basuma, Bentancur. Looks real good on paper. And Harry Kane hasn't gone anywhere yet. That attack looks real good on paper too. I'll believe it when I see it. There is a cultural change that has to take place, and until that cultural change takes place, I'm not holding my breath about this team. I'm not believing they're anything more than a top four hopeful. And at this point, just not a top four club. I talked about everything I believe in Ange Postecoglou, why I do see a world in which this works. There are just 14 things that need to happen, and maybe that's even too small of a number, at Spurs before we can start talking about them being contenders and being back to being one of the top four clubs in this league. And a true threat. First, you got to get fans believing again. And you got to get the club back with some positive vibes. James Madison is not going to do that for you. It's nothing about him in particular. It's just way bigger than one signing. It's a good deal, good piece of business by Spurs. Excited to see what he can do with that kind of attacking talent. It just doesn't change the bottom line for me in terms of where this club is at. Then jumping into MLS news, trying to kind of quickly go through a lot of things here because so much has happened. Bob Bradley out at Toronto. This was the news earlier in the week. I had mentioned this a while back, at least once, if not multiple times, that if this didn't come together quickly, this needed to happen. They could not continue this season with Bob Bradley coaching and having two disgruntled Italian designated players. You can have conversations about kind of where the responsibility ultimately lies that this didn't work, and it doesn't matter. Bob Bradley is the one who is easy to move, and Bob Bradley was never going to win a power struggle against Bernardeschi and Insigne. If they wanted him gone and the results weren't there to keep him in his job, he was going to go. And so Toronto made this move early enough that you can salvage this season. They are only 7 points out of a playoff spot. Now that you have to then have a wild card game to get to the quarterfinals, it's not a great situation to be in. But if you can get in and you can win that first game, all of a sudden, you're guaranteed a home game in that best of three quarterfinal round. Maybe you get some, catch up break here or there. It is entirely possible. Just like it is with Miami, if Miami finds a way to get in. You ask me which team, if you tell me one of these teams is getting in, we'll talk about Inter Miami next, it's Toronto. I don't see how Inter Miami are turning this around until next season. Toronto, I could see a world in which they go on a run and sneak in, and then you want no part of them. But that wasn't going to happen with the status quo. The situation needed to change. The way to do that, the most logical way to do that, and the easiest way, was to get Bob Bradley out of the equation. And I will also continue to go back to the most glaring statistic with this team. They are still bad defensively. They still give up goals that make you wonder what in the world they're doing. There are also only two teams that have scored fewer goals than them in the Eastern Conference. They've scored one goal fewer, and they are Inter Miami and the New York Red Bulls, both of whom have already fired coaches and, parted ways with coaches, and are just not good in attack. Red Bulls have had all those injuries, and Miami just can't get the attack going, and also have had all the injuries in the midfield. Just lost your left back, reportedly, maybe for the season. It's not been great for either of those clubs. That's the level Toronto is playing at in attack, with Bernardeschi and Insigne generally out there. It's not like they've missed the entire season. I thought they were going to fix the defense with the players they brought in, the new center backs with Sean Johnson. That hasn't happened. That needs to change for them to actually get to a point where they're a contender. But job number one is to start getting this team to score goals the way it should. I never thought a Bob Bradley coach team with that kind of talent and attack would have this many problems going forward. But that's where they're at. And that's also the thing that can change, right? If they start scoring, they can absolutely start climbing up the Eastern Conference and get into the playoffs. The next decision you have to make, this is the last thing I want to touch on quickly. You also need to decide on whether these are your guys moving forward. And you got to fix the defense if this is where you're going long term. Because they are young enough that they could go back to Europe It hasn't worked. We're at basically a year now, maybe a little bit less. I don't remember exactly when they debuted. But we've got, 20 plus games of data here, more like 30, I think. This isn't just them jumping into the middle of an MLS season after they just played a full season in Europe, trying to get acclimated. They had a full off season. It's not any better than it was last season. If anything, it's worse. So you got to make a decision either to cater your coaching hire to these two guys, which is where names like Andrea Pirlo get interesting, and now Andrea Pirlo is not available because he took a job in Serie B. A big-time name that'll earn these guys respect, an international name. Or are you going to hit the reset button, see if you can sell them, get out of their salaries, and try again with a different set of high-profile DPs? Regardless, this team is not going to win MLS Cup until it fixes what's happening at the back. But this has been such a disaster that you got to start wondering if it's worth it trying again with a different coach. Because I refuse to believe Bob Bradley was the singular problem here. Now, it's a weird dynamic with having Michael as the captain and Michael being injured. It's all strange. But I refuse to put everything that's happened and what you read, the reporting The Athletic did about the way that Bernadeschi and Insigne have behaved at times, and just throw this on Bob Bradley. He couldn't find a way to make it work. These guys are too important to sacrifice for the coach, obviously. But something else needs to change too. You're not just going to put another coach in there and make this all work. Maybe somebody can figure it out. But this was a spectacular failure that everybody needs to take responsibility for. Next in our MLS news, Inter Miami have their coach. It is the one that it seemed like it was going to be from the very beginning when Messi announced he was coming. It is Tata Martino. Round 3 for Tata Martino with Lionel Messi. Complicated relationship, certainly. Didn't have an incredible amount of success together. Some ups, some downs. But I've talked about this before, so I'm going to keep this pretty brief as well. One, they're at a very different position in their careers at this point. Two, I have faith in their ability to get along. They don't need to be best friends. It seems like there was a lot of just kind of drama that was drummed up that wasn't really there between these two. I have to believe that the Newell's Old Boy, Argentina hometown connection is going to continues to carry a lot of weight. That means so much to Messi that there aren't going to be any issues here. And of course, Martino isn't getting this job if he doesn't have Messi's seal of approval. Martino is the only person who both understands how to work with Messi, how to build a team around Messi, and how to first, how to build an MLS roster from scratch, which is going to be really important because that's essentially what you're doing here. And two, how to work within the constraints of Major League Soccer to build a team that can win a championship. You will not find that combination anywhere else, which is why, to me, this had to be the hire. This is your best option unless he turns you down, and he wasn't turning this job down. There isn't another person who blends Messi and MLS the way Tata Martino does. Yeah, Mexico was kind of a disaster. Again, kind of going back to my Bob Bradley point. Look at what happens after Tata Martino left. They've already fired another manager. Is it really all his fault? He certainly made some mistakes. But there's a lot more going on than just him within the Mexican Federation right now. He was phenomenal in MLS. He built a team that won a championship, and he built it from scratch. And he's essentially going to get to do the same thing here. Because there just aren't any pieces on that team that are immovable that you can't do something with. It might cost you. You might have to sell Leo Campana for cheap, for example, to clear some DP spots, depending on how this all works. I have questions about what this roster is going to end up looking like because you need guys that are going to run and do the dirty work, and you need to fix that defense. I don't see that happening this season. But if there is somebody that I have faith in that can actually make this what it can be and can build a MLS Cup contender around Messi, it is Tata Martino. One final MLS note I wanted to mention real quickly before I take my break. Teemu Pukki headed to Minnesota United. Here are some fun facts about the Loons and their attack. They have not had a double-digit goal scorer other than Emmanuel Reynoso since 2019. That was Darwin Quintero. He had 10 goals. Since about that same time, Teemu Pukki has scored more than that 2 different times on teams that finished bottom of the Premier League, and in a quote-unquote bad season last season with Norwich that he's just coming off, he scored 10 goals in the championship. It's fair to wonder if you can get Pukki back to being the player Pukki was 2-3 years ago. This might just be who he is at this point. It might also just be a bad season at Norwich. You don't know on that. We're just going to have to see. But at his worst, Teemu Pukki is still providing a level of production that Minnesota has not had at the number 9 spot. And that's doing it against, Championship and Premier League without an Emmanuel Reynoso. This could end up being a home run. It is risky because Pukki kind of fits the profile of guys who don't always have success in MLS. I'm not totally sold on this being a phenomenal move. But I feel better about this floor than I do most of these other type of signings, and specifically the higher profile, bigger names. This guy scores goals. He's done it year after year after year. Is he the kind of number 9 you need to become a championship team? That remains to be seen. A team that could legitimately win MLS? That I'm not convinced of. But he is an absolute upgrade for a team that's not all that far away. And if he gets going and he gets in really good form, he absolutely can be the kind of piece that elevates you into that upper tier. This is a team that's 8 points out of 3rd place and has 2 games in hand. And I believe it's the Sounders who are in 3rd right now. They are right there in the jumbled mess that is the middle of the Western Conference. You go on a little bit of a run, and all of a sudden you're up into that 4, 5, 6 area, fighting for a home field advantage in the quarterfinals. This is a team that's had postseason success before. I never, ever want to pick against them in the playoffs. Emmanuel Reynoso's back now. And it's a Western Conference where only St. Louis City, an expansion team that's never done this before, and LAFC, who have just been bad since the CONCACAF Champions League ended, are the only 2 teams that have separated themselves. 3rd place is up for grabs. And it might get to a point where the top spots in this conference are up for grabs. You got Houston goes on a little bit of a run, beats LAFC twice. All of a sudden, they're right there, safely in the playoff spots, at least for now. A few weeks ago, they weren't even in the playoffs. Now I think they're 5th. That's how close everything is. One move can make a huge difference. This roster is good. Maybe not quite at the level as some other Minnesota United teams when you're comparing what Minnesota has now to what the other teams have, because the league continues to get better and better. But there's just something about Adrian Healy, this club, that I just don't want any part of him in the postseason. And if you can get it, and they were, look how close they came with just Reynoso a few seasons ago. Now you throw in another guy who's, scoring 10 plus goals in the Premier League and scoring 20 plus in the championship on a couple occasions. This could get real interesting, and I would not be surprised at all if we're talking about Minnesota at the end of the year as one of the top 5 teams in the West. I'm not convinced, but you got to give yourself an opportunity. Reynoso, from a performance on the field standpoint, what Adrian Healy has done, the way this club has worked, you've got to be willing to spend the money to take the chance to try and elevate yourself. And Minnesota United have done that. Just got to see how it works and whether Teemu Pukki is the guy to make it happen.